In this gripping tale of racism and resilience, Dr. Evan Cole, a black physician, returns to his hometown to open a community clinic, but faces relentless opposition from a corrupt deputy and town officials determined to maintain the status quo. Harassed, falsely accused, and humiliated, Evan's efforts to bring healthcare to the underserved are met with systemic racism and abuse of power. As tensions rise, the story exposes the infuriating depths of prejudice in a small town, forcing Evan to confront not only the corrupt system but also the personal and public battles that define the fight for justice. Dr. Evan Cole adjusted his glasses and glanced out the window of his car, a low-profile sedan that he insisted on driving himself, despite his assistant's protests. The streets of Millbrooke stretched before him, a blend of historic charm and economic stagnation. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow on the brick facades of old shops and cafes lining the main road. Millbrooke had once been a thriving town, but decades of systemic neglect had left its infrastructure crumbling and its residents struggling for Evan, a nationally celebrated heart surgeon and philanthropist. Millbrooke wasn't just any small town, it was his hometown, a place filled with memories, both cherished and bitter. Evan had returned to Millbrooke a month ago, intending to establish a free clinic for underserved residents. His success in urban hospitals and on national medical boards had made him a household name in his field. But here in Millbrooke, he was still Evan from down the street, the kid who grew up in a modest bungalow on Willow Lane, and in some corners of this town, he was just a black man in a white-dominated community, a fact that no amount of success or good intentions could entirely erase. Tonight, he decided to visit Millbrooke Diner, a modest establishment known for its home-cooked meals and strong coffee. It was one of those places where the regulars nursed their cups for hours, swapping stories and grumbles about the state of the world. Evan had spent many afternoons here as a teenager, studying at the counter with a stack of books, trying to drown out the noise of his parents arguing over bills. He wanted to see if it still felt the same. When he pushed open the diner's heavy glass door, the bell above jingled, signaling his entrance. The smell of sizzling bacon and fresh pie greeted him like an old friend. Conversations quieted momentarily as patrons glanced his way. Most returned to their meals and chatter, but a few eyes lingered, assessing him with faint curiosity or thinly veiled skepticism. "Evening, welcome to Millbrooke Diner," the waitress behind the counter called out. Her name tag read, Sue, and her smile seemed genuine, if a little weary. Evan offered a polite nod and slid onto a stool at the counter. "Good evening, I'll just have a coffee for now." Sue grabbed a mug and poured him a fresh cup, setting it in front of him with practiced efficiency. "First time in town?" she asked, leaning on the counter as she refilled the sugar dispenser. "Not quite," Evan replied, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong and slightly bitter, just as he remembered. "I grew up here." Sue raised an eyebrow, clearly trying to place him. "No kidding, been a while then." "About 20 years, Evan said. "Left for college and never quite made it back until recently." "Well, welcome back," she said with a nod. "Hope the town treats you right." Evan smiled faintly, appreciating her friendliness. "Thanks, I hope so too." As he sipped his coffee, Evan's attention drifted to the other diners. Near the window sat an older couple sharing a plate of fries, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same piece. At a booth in the corner, a young father was coaxing his toddler to eat her vegetables. The warm, domestic scene was offset by the low hum of a conversation taking place at a table near the kitchen. 3 men, all dressed in worn flannel and denim, were hunched over their cups, their voices pitched just loud enough to carry. "You hear about that clinic they're building over on 5th?" one of the men asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "Yeah, some big-shot doctor from the city's behind it," another replied, "thinking he can just come in and fix everything." The third man chuckled, shaking his head. "Betcha, he doesn't even know what it's like to live here, just another outsider trying to tell us what to do." Evan stiffened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral, pretending to be engrossed in his coffee. He was no stranger to comments like these. Over the years, he'd learned to let them roll off his back, but tonight, they stung a little more. This was his town too, no matter how much some people might try to deny it. As the conversation continued, Sue returned with a plate of pie. On the house, she said with a wink, sliding it in front of Evan. Welcome home special. Evan chuckled softly. Thank you. That's kind of you. He picked up his fork, about to take a bite, when the bell above the door jingled again. This time, the reaction was more pronounced. The low murmurs in the diner fell silent as a man in a deputy's uniform stepped inside, his boots thudding heavily against the tile floor. Evening, folks, Deputy Daniels said, his voice carrying a practiced authority. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that seemed perpetually fixed in a smirk. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his hand rested casually on his belt, just inches from his holstered gun. Daniels's gaze swept the room before settling on Evan. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or maybe just curiosity. Either way, it wasn't friendly. You new around here? Daniels asked, walking up to the counter. Evan met his gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. No, I grew up here. Daniels tilted his head slightly, as if sizing him up. That's so don't think I remember you. Evan set his fork down, his tone calm but firm. I've been away for a while, just moved back to start a clinic downtown. Daniel's smirk widened, but there was no warmth in it. A clinic? Huh, mighty ambitious for a place like Millbrooke. It's something the town needs, Evan said evenly. Affordable healthcare for people who can't otherwise access it. Daniels chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. Guess we'll see how that works out. Before Evan could respond, Daniels turned to Sue. Coffee, black? Sue poured the coffee quickly, avoiding eye contact with Daniels. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted, the warmth from earlier replaced by a palpable tension. Evan took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain composed. This was not the time or place for confrontation, but he knew this encounter was just the beginning. Daniels wasn't just another customer, he was a man who wielded power in a town where the lines between justice and prejudice often blurred. As Daniels sipped his coffee, he leaned casually against the counter, his gaze occasionally flicking back to Evan. The unspoken challenge in his posture was clear. You don't belong here, and I'm going to make sure you know it. Evan finished his pie and coffee, leaving a generous tip on the counter. As he stood to leave, he met Daniel's gaze one last time, his voice steady. Have a good evening, deputy. Daniel's smirk remained, but he said nothing, watching as Evan walked out the door and into the crisp night air. As Evan made his way to his car, he felt the weight of the encounter settle on his shoulders. Millbrooke hadn't changed as much as he'd hoped, but if he was going to make this clinic a reality, he would need more than just determination. He would need resilience, allies, and an unwavering belief that change was possible, even in a place like this. The next morning, Evan walked into the old municipal building downtown, its worn limestone facade a testament to Millbrooke's long-neglected infrastructure. The city council had scheduled a meeting to discuss zoning approval for his clinic, and Evan wanted to ensure everything went smoothly. The clinic would occupy a defunct hardware store on 5th Street, a space Evan had already started renovating, but the final approval depended on the council's decision. The meeting room was modest, with outdated wooden chairs and a long table that seemed too big for the cramped space. A handful of council members sat at one end, their papers and pens scattered across the table. The audience area was sparsely populated, with only a few locals present to observe. At the far side of the room, Deputy Daniels leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his watchful gaze pinned on Evan. Evan had expected this. Daniels wasn't just a deputy. He had deep ties to Millbrooke's old guard, the kind of people who clung tightly to their power and traditions, resisting any change that might threaten the status quo. Evan suspected Daniels was here to intimidate him, a reminder that Millbrooke wasn't quite ready to embrace someone like him in a leadership role. Taking a seat in the audience, Evan smoothed his tie and sat upright, exuding the quiet confidence that had carried him through countless high-pressure moments in operating rooms and board meetings. He focused on the council members, determined to ignore Daniels' looming presence. Next on the agenda, the council chairwoman, Margaret Winslow, announced, adjusting her glasses, is the zoning application for a proposed medical clinic on 5th Street. Dr. Evan Cole is the applicant. Evan stood, buttoning his jacket, before stepping to the front of the room. Good morning, Chairwoman Winslow, members of the council. Thank you for allowing me to present today. He outlined his plan with precision and clarity, emphasizing the clinic's benefits for the town: free medical care for uninsured residents, job opportunities, and partnerships with local businesses to stimulate the economy. He had anticipated questions and counter-arguments, preemptively addressing concerns about funding, staffing, and potential liabilities. The room remained quiet, save for the occasional scratch of pens on paper. When Evan finished, he scanned the faces of the council members, searching for any signs of encouragement or resistance. Most wore neutral expressions, but one man, Councilman Ted Grayson, leaned back in his chair with a faint smirk, his arms crossed. "Well, Dr. Cole," Grayson drawled, his tone deliberately slow, "I have to say, your proposal sounds mighty ambitious for a small town like Millbrooke. What makes you so sure this kind of clinic will work here?" Evan met Grayson's gaze evenly. "I've worked in underserved communities before, Councilman Grayson. I've seen the impact that accessible healthcare can have on families and entire neighborhoods. With the right support, I believe this clinic can make a significant difference here." Grayson tilted his head, his smirk widening. "And how do you plan to deal with, let's call it, community pushback? Some folks around here might not be too keen on the idea of a free clinic attracting all kinds of people from outside Millbrooke." The implication was clear, and a ripple of discomfort passed through the audience. Evan kept his expression neutral, though his chest tightened. "The clinic will serve Millbrooke residents," Evan replied firmly. "Our focus is on providing care to those who live and work in this town." Grayson shrugged, feigning indifference. "Still, you can't blame people for being concerned. Change isn't always easy." Before Evan could respond, another council member, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, spoke up. "Dr. Cole, I think your proposal is exactly what Millbrooke needs. We've been struggling to provide adequate health care for years, and this clinic could be a lifeline for so many families." Evan nodded, grateful for her support. "Thank you, Councilwoman Hayes. I'm committed to working with the community to ensure this clinic meets everyone's needs." The chairwoman interjected, glancing at her watch. "If there are no further questions, we'll proceed to a vote." But before she could call for the vote, Deputy Daniels pushed off the wall and strode to the front of the room. "Excuse me, Madam Chair," he said, his voice carrying a note of authority. "I'd like to say a few words before you make any decisions." Evan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent as Daniels positioned himself beside the council table, his broad frame towering over the seated members. "I've lived in Millbrooke my whole life," Daniels began, his tone measured but edged with a subtle hostility. "And I've seen a lot of outsiders come through here, promising big changes. Most of them don't stick around long enough to deal with the mess they leave behind." Daniels turned his gaze to Evan, a hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "Now, I'm not saying Dr. Cole doesn't have good intentions, but good intentions don't always work out in practice. This clinic might bring more trouble than it's worth." The room fell silent, the weight of Daniels' words hanging in the air. Evan felt a flash of anger, but he forced himself to remain composed. He'd dealt with skeptics and detractors before, though rarely in such a blatant display of prejudice. "Deputy Daniels," Evan said, his voice calm but firm, "I appreciate your perspective, but I believe the data and evidence I've provided speak for themselves. This clinic isn't about bringing trouble, it's about bringing solutions." Daniels crossed his arms, his smirk deepening. "Sure, but solutions for who? That's the real question, isn't it?" The council members exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the room palpable. Evan's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he resisted the urge to respond further. He knew engaging Daniels on his terms would only escalate the situation. Chairwoman Winslow cleared her throat, cutting through the silence. "Thank you, Deputy Daniels. Your concerns are noted. We'll proceed with the vote." The next few moments passed in a blur. The council approved the zoning application by a narrow margin, with Grayson and one other member voting against it. Evan exhaled quietly, relieved, but not victorious. The battle for the clinic was far from over. As the meeting adjourned, Daniels lingered near the door, his presence a looming reminder of the challenges ahead. Evan walked past him without a word, his posture straight and his expression unreadable. He wouldn't give Daniels the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than usual, but Evan's thoughts were clouded. He'd expected resistance, but the overt hostility from Daniels and Grayson had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The clinic was more than a project to him. It was a symbol of hope for a town that desperately needed it. Yet the obstacles in his path felt as entrenched as the town's history itself. As Evan approached his car, he noticed Lisa Thompson, his clinic coordinator, waiting for him. Her expression was a mix of concern and determination. "How'd it go?" Evan forced a small smile. "We got the approval, but it wasn't easy." Lisa frowned. "Let me guess, Daniels?" Evan nodded. "Him and a few others? They're not going to make this easy for us." Lisa crossed her arms, her gaze steely. "They don't have to like it. We're here to help people, and we're not backing down." Evan smiled, her resolve bolstering his own. "No, we're not." As they drove back to the temporary clinic office, Evan's mind churned with plans. The approval was a step forward, but it was clear that systemic challenges and prejudices would continue to test his resolve. He would have to navigate these obstacles with the same precision and care he brought to his work in the operating room, because the stakes were just as high. The steady hum of machinery filled the temporary clinic office as Evan scrolled through patient records on his tablet. The day had been long but productive, and the clinic had already seen an uptick in patients seeking care. Each visit was a small victory, a reminder of why he'd returned to Millbrooke. But even as he focused on the success of the day, the shadow of Deputy Daniels lingered in his mind. Lisa entered the office, her face tight with worry. She held her phone up, the screen glowing with a news alert. "You need to see this," she said, her tone low and urgent. Evan frowned and took the phone. The headline read, "Controversy surrounds proposed clinic. Residents voice concerns over unwanted changes." Beneath it was a photo of Evan at the council meeting, standing beside Deputy Daniels. The article quoted Grayson extensively, painting the clinic as a potential disruption to Millbrooke's small-town values. Daniels was also quoted, questioning the clinic's necessity and implying it could invite troublemakers into the town. Evan's stomach tightened as he read. The article was thinly veiled propaganda, designed to stoke fear and resistance. "This is bad," he muttered. "It gets worse," Lisa said, pulling up another tab. Social media posts were already circulating, some sharing the article, others twisting it further. Comments ranged from skepticism about the clinic to outright racism, targeting Evan personally. "City doctor thinks he can play savior. They'll turn 5th Street into a slum. What's next? Free housing for criminals." Lisa read aloud, her voice thick with disgust. Evan set the phone down, exhaling slowly. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore." Lisa's eyes burned with anger. "We need to fight back. Hold a press conference, put out a statement. Something." Evan rubbed his temples, weighing his options. He had expected resistance, but the coordinated attack was more vicious and public than he'd imagined. "If we respond now, we're playing their game. We need to be strategic." Before Lisa could reply, the clinic's front door banged open, and heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. A moment later, Deputy Daniels appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 other officers. His expression was cold, predatory. "Dr. Cole," Daniels said, his tone clipped. "We need to have a word." Lisa stepped forward, her voice sharp. "What's this about, Deputy?" Daniels ignored her, his gaze fixed on Evan. "We've received reports of unauthorized medical practices happening here. I need to see your licenses and permits." Evan stood, his heart pounding. "Everything is in order, Deputy. I can show you the documentation." Daniels smirked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "That's good to hear, but we've also had complaints about potential violations of health codes. We'll need to conduct an inspection." Evan's jaw tightened. He knew this wasn't about permits or health codes. It was an intimidation tactic, plain and simple. "You're welcome to inspect the premises, but I'd appreciate it if you scheduled a time like any other official would." Daniel's smirk widened. "We'll see about that." He gestured to the officers, who began moving through the clinic, opening cabinets and drawers without care. Equipment clattered as they rifled through supplies, their actions more invasive than investigative. Lisa's face flushed with anger. "This is harassment, and you know it." Daniels turned to her, his expression mockingly innocent. "Just doing my job, ma'am." Evan's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. Deputy Daniels, if you have a legitimate concern, you can take it up with the county health department. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you stop disrupting patient care. Daniels stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You think you're better than us, don't you? Coming back here, trying to change everything. You don't belong here, Dr. Cole. The words hit Evan like a slap, but he refused to show it. Instead, he met Daniel's gaze, his voice steady. I belong here just as much as anyone else. Now, unless you have a warrant, I suggest you leave. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading. For a moment, the tension was suffocating. Then he stepped back, motioning for the other officers to follow. We'll be back, he said, his tone dripping with menace. Count on it. As the door slammed shut behind them, Lisa turned to Evan, her expression a mix of fury and concern. We can't let this slide. Evan nodded, his mind already racing. We won't. That evening, Evan sat at his kitchen table, reviewing his options. The harassment was escalating, and it was clear that Daniels and his allies wouldn't stop until they'd driven him out of town. He needed to act decisively, but every move carried risks, not just for him, but for the clinic and the people it served. His phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Margaret Winslow, the council chairwoman. We need to talk urgent. Evan called her back immediately. Margaret, what's going on? Her voice was strained. I've been getting calls all day. People are upset about the clinic, saying it's going to bring down property values, attract the wrong crowd, and Grayson is stirring the pot, claiming we rushed the zoning approval. Evan's grip tightened on the phone. Are you reconsidering the vote? Margaret hesitated. Not yet, but there's a lot of pressure to call another meeting if this keeps up. She didn't finish the sentence, but Evan understood his clinic was hanging by a thread, and Daniels and Grayson were doing everything they could to cut it. Thanks for letting me know, Evan said. I'll handle it. After hanging up, Evan stared at the phone, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He couldn't let them win, but he also couldn't fight this battle alone. He reached out to his network, calling a few trusted colleagues and community leaders. Among them was Reverend Samuel Green, a well-respected figure in Millbrooke who had long been an advocate for social justice. The Reverend had seen his share of battles against systemic racism, and Evan hoped he could lend his support. Dr. Cole, Reverend Green said warmly when he answered the call. I've been hearing about the clinic. You've got quite the fight on your hands. I do, Evan admitted. And I need your help. Daniels and his allies are trying to shut us down. I want to organize a community meeting to rally support, but I need someone like you to help get people there. Reverend Green's voice grew firm. Say no more, I'll spread the word. This town needs that clinic, and I'll make sure folks know it. Thank you, Evan said, relief washing over him. I won't forget this. The community meeting was scheduled for the following evening at the local church. As Evan stood at the front of the sanctuary, he was heartened to see the pews filling with residents, some familiar, others new. Reverend Green stood beside him, his presence a calming force. Evan began to speak, his voice steady, despite the nerves gnawing at him. He shared his vision for the clinic, the challenges he'd faced, and the stakes involved. He spoke not just as a doctor, but as someone who cared deeply about the town and its people. The audience listened intently, and when he finished, applause filled the room. But before the meeting could end, the church doors creaked open, and Daniels strode in, flanked by Grayson and a few other skeptics. The air grew heavy with tension as the deputy stepped forward, his smirk firmly in place. Quite the turnout, Daniels said, his voice carrying an edge. But let's not forget, talk is cheap. Actions have consequences, Dr. Cole. Evan's pulse quickened, but he refused to back down. I'm aware of the consequences, deputy, and I'm prepared to face them. Daniel's smirk faltered, if only for a moment. The room fell silent, the anticipation thick in the air. Daniels and Grayson have escalated their efforts to discredit Evan, culminating in their disruptive appearance at the community meeting. Evan's resolve is unshaken, but the tension has reached a boiling point, setting the stage for a decisive confrontation in the next section. The air in the sanctuary was thick with tension, as Deputy Daniels' voice echoed off the walls. The warmth and unity Evan had fostered moments earlier felt like it was evaporating under the weight of Daniels' presence. Reverend Green moved closer to Evan, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the room. "I'm curious, Dr. Cole," Daniels continued, his voice oozing faux curiosity. "Did you mention to all these fine folks that your so-called clinic has already been flagged for several violations? Seems like you're building a house on sand." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the seeds of doubt Daniels hoped to sow taking root. Evan took a step forward, his posture steady, his tone firm. "Deputy Daniels, if you have legitimate accusations, I suggest you provide evidence rather than vague insinuations." Daniels smirked, unrolling a piece of paper he'd pulled from his pocket. "Oh, I have evidence. A report filed just this morning outlines several code violations at your current setup: unsafe practices, improper storage of medical supplies. Shall I go on?" Evan's jaw tightened. He knew the report was fabricated, part of Daniels' ongoing campaign to discredit him. But Daniels wasn't just trying to shut down the clinic. He was trying to destroy Evan's credibility in front of the community. Before Evan could respond, Reverend Green stepped in. "Deputy, this isn't the time or place for this discussion. If you have concerns, take them up with the proper authorities." Daniels ignored the Reverend, his gaze fixed on Evan. "Or maybe you'd prefer we discuss it at the station. You know, officially." A sharp gasp came from the crowd as two officers stepped forward, their hands resting on their belts. The message was clear. This wasn't a debate. It was an ambush. Lisa, seated in the front row, stood abruptly. "This is harassment, and everyone here knows it. You're targeting Dr. Cole because you don't like what he represents." Daniel's smirk widened. "What I don't like, ma'am, is people breaking the law. Now, Dr. Cole, are you going to come with us quietly? Or do we have to make this harder than it needs to be?" Evan's hands clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their trust and respect hanging in the balance. Daniels wanted him to lash out, to give him a reason to escalate further. But Evan refused to give him that satisfaction. "I'll go with you," Evan said evenly, his voice carrying across the room, "but only to clear up whatever false accusations you fabricated." Reverend Green placed a hand on Evan's shoulder. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "We'll stand with you." Evan shook his head. "I appreciate that, Reverend, but this fight isn't won by running. I'll face this head on." Daniels gestured to the officers, who stepped forward and cuffed Evan's hands. The crowd erupted in outrage, several community members standing to protest the blatant misuse of power. "This is wrong," a woman shouted. "Dr. Cole is trying to help us," another added. Evan met the crowd's gaze as he was led toward the door, his expression calm despite the turmoil swirling around him. "Stay strong," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't over." At the station, the fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow over the sterile walls. Evan sat in the holding room. His wrists aching from the too tight cuffs Daniels had insisted on. His mind raced as he replayed the scene in the church, the faces of the community members etched in his memory. Lisa had promised to rally support and contact legal help. He knew she wouldn't rest until she'd exhausted every avenue to get him released. Still, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him. It was about the clinic, the people it would serve, and the message it would send. If Daniels succeeded in derailing it, the door creaked open, and Daniels strolled in, his smirk firmly in place. He carried a folder, which he dropped onto the table with a theatrical thud. "Dr. Cole," Daniels began, his tone mocking. "Or should I say Mr. Cole, now that your credibility's in question, you've made quite a mess for yourself, haven't you?" Evan didn't respond, refusing to rise to the bait. He kept his gaze steady, his silence a quiet defiance. Daniels leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Think you can just waltz into this town and change everything?" "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Evan said, his voice calm. "But I do think Millbrooke deserves better than this." Daniel's smirk faltered for a brief moment before returning. "You're not going to win. You know people like you never do. You think this town's gonna rally behind you? They'll turn on you the second they realize you're nothing but trouble." Evan leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "The only trouble in this town is people like you, Daniels. People who abuse their power to keep others down. That's not strength, it's fear." Daniels straightened, his smirk replaced by a flicker of anger. We'll see how brave you are when this whole clinic nonsense blows up in your face." Hours later, Evan was released on bail, thanks to Reverend Green's intervention and Lisa's relentless advocacy. As he stepped outside, he was greeted by a crowd of supporters gathered in front of the station, their faces lit by the glow of cell phones and streetlights. "Dr. Cole!" someone shouted, and the crowd erupted into cheers and chants of support. Evan's heart swelled as he took in the sight. These people weren't just his patients or neighbors, they were his allies. Daniels might have power, but Evan had something far stronger, a community that believed in him. Reverend Green stepped forward, his expression resolute. "We're not going to let them win, Dr. Cole. The people are with you." Evan nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then let's fight back." Evan's unjust arrest has galvanized the community, transforming the fight for the clinic into a broader movement against systemic corruption. With Daniels's intimidation tactics exposed, Evan is more determined than ever to take a stand. The stage is set for a climactic confrontation that will determine the future of the clinic, and Millbrooke itself. The town hall buzzed with tension. Word had spread quickly about Evan's arrest and subsequent release, sparking outrage across Millbrooke. The council had been forced to convene an emergency meeting, and the small chamber was packed with community members, their faces a mixture of anger and determination. Outside, dozens more gathered with signs and chants, their voices carrying through the night air. Evan sat near the front, flanked by Lisa and Reverend Green. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, their collective hope resting squarely on his shoulders. Daniels leaned against a far wall, his smirk as infuriating as ever. Councilman Grayson sat at the head of the table, his expression cool and calculated. Chairwoman Winslow called the meeting to order, her gavel striking the wooden block with a sharp crack. "This meeting has been called to address allegations regarding the proposed clinic on 5th Street and concerns about recent actions taken by law enforcement." Her gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Daniels before landing on Evan. "Dr. Cole, would you like to speak first?" Evan stood, his movements measured and deliberate. He adjusted his tie and stepped to the center of the room, meeting the eyes of the council and the crowd. He could feel his heart pounding, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Thank you, Chairwoman Winslow, members of the council, and my fellow residents of Millbrooke. I stand before you tonight not just as a doctor or a business owner, but as someone who deeply believes in the potential of this town." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "The clinic I've proposed is not about disrupting our community or changing its character. It's about addressing a desperate need for accessible healthcare, a need that many of you have expressed to me personally." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, emboldening him. "But instead of focusing on the merits of this clinic, we've been sidetracked by fear-mongering and personal attacks. Certain individuals have used their positions of power to spread misinformation and undermine this effort. Not because they truly believe it's harmful, but because they are afraid of change." Daniels pushed off the wall, his smirk fading. "Are you accusing me, Dr. Cole?" Evan turned to him, his expression calm but unyielding. "If the shoe fits, Deputy Daniels." The room erupted into gasps and whispers. Daniels took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're treading on thin ice, Doctor. Be careful what you say." Evan held his ground. "I have nothing to hide, can you say the same?" Daniels' jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Lisa stood. "Actually, we have something to say about that." All eyes turned to her as she held up a folder. "While you were busy fabricating reports about our clinic, Deputy Daniels, we were busy uncovering the truth about you." The murmurs grew louder as Lisa handed the folder to Chairwoman Winslow, who began to leaf through its contents. Her face paled as she read. "What is this?" "It's evidence of misconduct," Lisa said, her voice ringing clear. "Deputy Daniels has been using his position to intimidate residents, falsify reports, and protect certain individuals in exchange for favors." Daniels scoffed, but there was a flicker of panic in his eyes. "That's a lie." Lisa ignored him, addressing the council. "We spoke to several residents who were afraid to come forward before now. They've documented instances of harassment and abuse of power by Daniels. We've also found discrepancies in his financial records, large sums of money unaccounted for." The room erupted into chaos. Grayson banged his gavel, his expression dark. "Order. We will have order." Daniels stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. This is a smear campaign. They're trying to discredit me because they know the clinic is a bad idea. Evan faced Daniels, his voice calm but firm. This isn't about the clinic, Daniels. This is about accountability. You've spent years using fear and intimidation to hold on to power, but tonight, it ends. Daniels lunged toward Evan, his fists clenched, but two other officers intercepted him, pulling him back. The crowd erupted into shouts, some calling for Daniels' resignation, others demanding his arrest. Chairwoman Winslow raised her voice above the commotion. Enough, Deputy Daniels. Until these allegations are thoroughly investigated, you are hereby suspended from duty. Officers, escort him out. Daniels struggled against the officers, his face a mask of rage. You think this is over? You think you've won? You'll regret this, Cole. Evan didn't flinch as Daniels was dragged out of the room, his threats echoing in the air. The tension in the room shifted, a collective exhale of relief mingling with the buzz of adrenaline. Chairwoman Winslow turned to Evan, her expression weary but sincere. Dr. Cole, on behalf of the council, I want to apologize for the treatment you've endured. The actions taken against you were unwarranted and unacceptable. Evan nodded, his voice steady. Thank you, Chairwoman. I hope this marks the beginning of a better future for Millbrooke. As the meeting adjourned, the crowd spilled into the night, their voices jubilant. Reporters swarmed Evan, their cameras flashing, but he waved them off, his focus on the community members who had stood by him. Lisa approached, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. We did it. Evan smiled faintly, the weight of the night settling over him. We took a step, but the fight isn't over. Reverend Green joined them, placing a reassuring hand on Evan's shoulder. One step at a time, Dr. Cole. Tonight, you showed this town what courage looks like. That's a victory in itself. Evan nodded, his resolve firm. The clinic will open, and Millbrooke will change, for the better. Though Daniels has been exposed and suspended, his parting threats linger, hinting at further challenges ahead. Evan's victory is significant, but far from complete, leaving the audience eager to see how he solidifies his clinic's place in the town and navigates the ongoing resistance. Evan Cole adjusted his tie and stepped into Millbrooke's courthouse, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. The town's small, modest courthouse was filled to capacity with residents, council members, and reporters. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. This meeting wasn't just about the clinic anymore. It had become a battle for the soul of the town. At the front of the room, Deputy Daniels stood with Councilman Grayson, their expressions cool and dismissive. Daniels leaned casually against the wooden rail, his smirk as infuriating as ever, while Grayson shuffled papers, feigning indifference to the murmurs of the crowd. Evan moved to the podium, his back straight, his gaze unwavering. Lisa and Reverend Green were seated behind him, their presence a quiet reminder of the allies he had gained in this fight. The community had rallied to his side, but Evan knew that the true confrontation lay ahead. Chairwoman Margaret Winslow banged her gavel, calling the meeting to order. Tonight, we address the allegations against the proposed clinic on 5th Street and review concerns raised by the community. Her eyes flicked to Evan. Dr. Cole, you may begin. Evan stepped forward, his voice calm but resonant. Thank you, Chairwoman Winslow, members of the council, residents of Millbrooke. I'm here tonight to set the record straight, not just about the clinic, but about the truth that's been buried under lies and intimidation. He scanned the room, his gaze steady. When I proposed this clinic, I knew it would face resistance. I knew change is hard, especially in a town like ours, where traditions run deep, but I never expected the level of hostility and deceit I've encountered. Daniels scoffed audibly, crossing his arms, but Evan ignored him. This clinic is not a threat to Millbrooke. It's an opportunity, a chance to provide health care to those who need it most, to bring jobs and resources to this community. And yet, certain individuals have done everything in their power to stop it, not because it's harmful, but because it challenges the status quo. Evan's voice grew sharper. Deputy Daniels has used his position to harass me, to fabricate violations, and to spread fear. He's not protecting this town, he's protecting himself. The room erupted into murmurs, the tension climbing. Daniels straightened, his smirk replaced with a glare. You'd better watch yourself, Cole, he growled. Evan turned to him, his tone unyielding. "I'm not afraid of you, Daniels, and neither is this town." Before Daniels could respond, Lisa stood, holding a thick folder. "If anyone doubts Dr. Cole's claims, we've gathered proof." She walked to the council table, handing the folder to Chairwoman Winslow. "This contains sworn statements from residents who have faced harassment at the hands of Deputy Daniels. It also includes financial records showing unexplained payments and falsified expense reports." Daniels' face darkened as Winslow began flipping through the folder. The room fell silent, the gravity of the evidence sinking in. Grayson interjected, his tone sharp. "This is highly irregular. You can't just barge in here with accusations and expect us to take them at face value." Lisa didn't back down. "We're not asking you to take it at face value, we're asking you to look at the facts. Deputy Daniels has abused his power for years, and it's time he's held accountable." The crowd murmured again, their whispers growing louder. Winslow raised a hand, silencing them. She turned to Daniels, her expression grim. "Deputy Daniels, do you have a response to these allegations?" Daniels stood, his posture stiff. "This is nothing but a smear campaign by outsiders who don't understand how this town works. I've dedicated my life to protecting Millbrooke, and I won't stand here and be vilified." Evan stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. "Protecting Millbrooke? Is that what you were doing when you fabricated violations against the clinic? When you arrested me without cause? When you used your badge to intimidate anyone who dared to stand up to you?" Daniels's face flushed red, his composure slipping. "You don't belong here, Cole. You think you can come in and change everything. You're nothing but a meddling outsider." Evan met his gaze, unflinching. "I belong here, as much as anyone else, and I'm not going anywhere." Winslow's gavel struck the table again, demanding order as the room erupted into applause. The tide was turning, and Daniels knew it. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a simmering rage. Grayson leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. "You think this is a victory? You think exposing Daniels changes anything? The people of this town don't want your clinic, Cole. You're fighting a losing battle." Evan turned to the council, his voice unwavering. "This isn't just about the clinic. This is about who we are as a community. Are we a town that clings to fear and corruption, or are we a town that stands for progress and justice?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Winslow looked at the council members, her expression resolute. "I believe we've heard enough. It's time to vote." The council members cast their votes one by one. As the final vote was tallied, Winslow looked up, her voice steady. "The council has decided to uphold the approval for the clinic on 5th Street." The room erupted into cheers, the community's support spilling over in a wave of relief and triumph. Evan felt a surge of emotion, his years of training in composure momentarily faltering as he smiled, his heart pounding with gratitude. But the victory was short-lived. As the crowd celebrated, Daniels stormed toward the exit, his parting words ringing through the room. "This isn't over, Cole. You've made an enemy you can't afford." Evan watched him go, his resolve hardening. He knew Daniels wasn't bluffing. This fight was far from over, but tonight, he had shown Millbrooke that change was possible, that standing up to corruption was worth the risk. As the crowd dispersed, Lisa approached, her expression a mix of pride and determination. "We did it." Evan nodded, his voice steady. "We took the first step, now we make sure it sticks." The council's approval is a significant victory, but Daniels' threats loom large, casting a shadow over the celebration. Evan's determination remains unshaken, but the challenges ahead promise to test him like never before. Evan Cole stood on the front steps of Millbrooke's courthouse, the brisk morning air filled with the sound of reporters' questions and the cheers of community members. The previous night's meeting had not only cemented the clinic's approval, but had also sent ripples through the town. The evidence against Deputy Daniels, combined with the council's decision to back the clinic, marked a turning point in the fight against corruption. Lisa stood beside Evan, her tablet in hand as she navigated the crowd. Reverend Green was nearby, speaking with a group of reporters about the importance of standing up to systemic injustice. The town was waking up to the truth, and Evan could feel the tide shifting. The morning after the meeting, news broke that Daniels had officially been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The evidence Lisa had presented during the meeting had prompted the county sheriff to step in, launching an inquiry into Daniel's misconduct. In the following weeks, more residents came forward with stories of harassment and intimidation. Each new testimony added weight to the case against Daniels, and soon, his allies, like Councilman Grayson, found themselves under scrutiny as well. Grayson's connections to Daniels' illicit activities were exposed, leading to his resignation from the council amid mounting public pressure. Daniels, once a powerful figure in Millbrooke, became a symbol of the corruption that had held the town back for decades. He was stripped of his badge, and criminal charges loomed as investigations uncovered a network of bribes and cover-ups. His fall from grace was swift and unrelenting, and Evan felt a sense of vindication, knowing that justice was finally being served. 3 months later, the clinic's grand opening drew a crowd that stretched down 5th Street. The building, once a neglected hardware store, had been transformed into a modern medical facility. Its glass doors gleamed in the sunlight, and the sign above them bore the name Millbrooke Community Health Center, a testament to the town's resilience. Evan stood inside the lobby, watching as the first patients arrived. The waiting area buzzed with life, families and individuals of all ages gathering to receive care. The staff, many of whom Evan had personally trained or recruited, moved with purpose and compassion, embodying the values he had fought so hard to uphold. Lisa approached, her expression a mix of pride and exhaustion. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Evan smiled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. "We did." As the day progressed, Evan moved between patients, meeting with families, and answering questions. Each interaction reinforced why he had come back to Millbrooke in the first place. The clinic wasn't just a building, it was a promise to the community, a commitment to providing care and hope to those who needed it most. The fallout from Daniel's exposure had sparked a broader reckoning in Millbrooke residents who had once been silent began to speak out, demanding transparency and accountability from local leaders. New candidates ran for office, campaigning on platforms of reform and equity. Evan's clinic became a focal point for these changes. A symbol of what the town could achieve when it stood together, Reverend Green organized monthly town halls, bringing residents together to discuss issues and brainstorm solutions. The energy in the air was different now, less resigned, more hopeful. Even the local press, which had initially been skeptical of Evan's efforts, began highlighting the clinic's success and the community's transformation. Articles celebrated the stories of patients who had received life-saving care and families who had found support through the clinic's outreach programs. Evan often reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The challenges he had faced, the hostility, the threats, the moments of doubt, had tested him in ways he never expected, but they had also strengthened his resolve. He had learned the power of standing firm in the face of adversity, of building alliances, and of trusting the people who believed in his vision. The fight against Daniels had shown him that change was possible, even in a place as resistant as Millbrooke, but it required persistence, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Late one evening, as he locked up the clinic, Evan paused to look at the empty street. The glow of the streetlights cast long shadows, but the darkness felt less oppressive. Now Millbrooke was still far from perfect, but it was on a path to something better. And so was he. Not everything was tied up neatly. The investigations into Daniels and Grayson continued, and while their removal had opened the door for progress, it also revealed just how deeply rooted the town's systemic issues were. Evan knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with setbacks. The clinic itself faced challenges, from securing sustainable funding to expanding services to meet growing demand. But Evan welcomed these challenges. They were a sign of progress, a reminder that the work was far from over. One afternoon, Lisa handed Evan a letter. It was an invitation to speak at a national healthcare conference about the clinic's success and its impact on Millbrooke. Evan read the letter twice, the weight of the opportunity sinking in. "You've become a bit of a celebrity," Lisa teased, her grin widening. "Ready to take the stage?" Evan chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't come here for fame, but if telling our story can help other communities, I'll do it." Lisa nodded. "You've inspired a lot of people, Evan, including me." Evan smiled, the sincerity in her words grounding him. He folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. "This is just the beginning." That evening, Evan joined Reverend Green and Lisa at a community bonfire hosted by local families. Children ran through the grass, their laughter filling the air, while neighbors shared food and stories. Evan sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, a sense of contentment washing over him. Green leaned over, his voice low. "You've done something remarkable here, Evan, but I have a feeling your work isn't done yet." Evan nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "There's still so much to do, but tonight, I'm grateful. For this moment, for these people." Green smiled, raising his cup in a silent toast. "To progress." As the fire crackled and the stars appeared overhead, Evan allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight for the clinic had changed him, but it had also revealed his purpose. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a catalyst for change, a bridge between what was and what could be. The camera of a local news crew panned across the crowd, capturing the bonfire and the faces of the people who had come together to celebrate. Evan knew that the story of Millbrooke wasn't over. It was still being written, one chapter at a time. And as he sat there, surrounded by the community he had fought for, he felt a quiet certainty. This was where he was meant to be, and he would keep fighting, not just for the clinic, but for the future of Millbrooke. The resolution provides emotional closure while leaving room for future challenges and growth. Evan's journey is far from over, but his triumphs and the community's transformation offer hope and inspiration. As the sun set over Millbrooke, painting the horizon in hues of gold and lavender, Evan Cole stood on the porch of the clinic, watching families filter out after another successful day. The past months had been the most challenging of his life, but they had also been the most rewarding. The fight to establish the clinic had tested every ounce of his resolve, but it had also reaffirmed his belief in the power of perseverance and community. Evan had grown through the ordeal. He had arrived in Millbrooke as a skilled doctor and a determined advocate, but the challenges he faced had reshaped him into a leader who understood the delicate balance between patience and persistence. The fight against Deputy Daniels and the entrenched corruption in Millbrooke had shown him the depth of systemic issues and the courage it took to confront them. He had learned that change wasn't just about pushing forward, it was about building alliances, listening to the people, and standing firm when the ground beneath him felt shaky. Reflecting on his journey, Evan realized how much his perspective had evolved. When he first returned to Millbrooke, he had seen the town's issues as obstacles to be overcome. Now he saw them as opportunities for connection and collaboration. The challenges had forced him to dig deeper into his own values and motivations, revealing a wellspring of resilience he hadn't fully tapped before. His relationship with the community had deepened, too. People who had once been hesitant to trust him now approached him with gratitude and hope. Parents thanked him for giving their children access to care they could never afford elsewhere. Elderly residents spoke of how the clinic had eased their burdens. Every story reaffirmed why he had come back to this small, struggling town. The fight had also revealed Evan's capacity for forgiveness. Despite everything Daniels had done to discredit and harm him, Evan found himself letting go of the bitterness. Holding on to that anger would have weighed him down, and Evan knew he had too much work ahead to carry that burden. His focus was on moving forward, not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in what the clinic stood for. The events in Millbrooke weren't just a local story, they reflected broader societal issues that resonated far beyond the town's borders. Evan's struggle against systemic racism and abuse of power highlighted the challenges that countless individuals and communities faced every day. Deputy Daniels wasn't an isolated figure. He was a symptom of a larger problem, a system that had allowed prejudice and corruption to fester unchecked. But the story also showed the power of collective action. The people of Millbrooke, who had once seemed divided and resigned to the status quo, had come together to demand change. Their voices had toppled a corrupt deputy, forced accountability on entrenched officials, and sparked a movement for reform. It was a reminder that no single person could dismantle systemic injustice, but together, communities could shift the tide. Evan hoped the clinic would serve as a model, not just for healthcare, but for what could happen when people refused to accept injustice. It was proof that progress was possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Evan's story wasn't just about a clinic, it was about the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the path was uncertain and the risks were high. He knew that his work was far from finished. The clinic had become a beacon of hope in Millbrooke, But it also came with new challenges: securing long-term funding, expanding services, and ensuring that the community's trust was maintained. Still, Evan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight against Daniels and the council had proven that change was possible, but it had also underscored the importance of vigilance. Systems didn't change overnight, and progress required constant effort. Evan was ready to meet that challenge, and he hoped his story would inspire others to do the same in their own communities. The people of Millbrooke had taught Evan as much as he had taught them. Their resilience, their willingness to stand together, and their belief in a better future had shown him that hope wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice. It was something people created through their actions, their words, and their unwavering commitment to justice. On the clinic porch, Reverend Green joined Evan, handing him a cup of tea. The two men stood in comfortable silence, watching the last of the day's patients wave goodbye. "You've come a long way," Green said finally, his voice warm with pride. "This town has too." Evan nodded, his gaze distant but thoughtful. "There were times I wasn't sure we'd make it, times I wanted to walk away." Green smiled knowingly. "But you didn't, and now look at what you've built." Evan turned to him, a small but genuine smile on his face. "I didn't do it alone. None of this would have happened without people like you, Lisa, and the community." Green's eyes sparkled with quiet humor. "You might not have done it alone, but you were the spark. This town needed someone willing to light the fire." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Evan felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been grueling, and the road ahead would be no less challenging. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. The clinic was more than just a building. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, the strength of community, and the belief that even in the darkest places, change could take root. Evan hoped that his story would inspire others to confront the injustices in their own lives, to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. The fight for justice wasn't a single battle. It was a series of choices, each one requiring courage and conviction. But as Millbrooke had shown, those choices could lead to something extraordinary. Change was possible. Progress was within reach. And it all began with the decision to take the first step. As the stars emerged in the night sky, Evan looked out at the town he had once thought he'd left behind for good. Now, it felt like home. Not because it was perfect, but because it was a place worth fighting for. And Evan Cole was ready to keep fighting.